And good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution. I'm joined by Woody Holton, Professor of History at the University of South Carolina. Today is September the 29th. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. This is Andy Mink, and on behalf of our team, Meredith, Mike, and Raven, I want to express our appreciation for you joining us on a Thursday night. Also want to express my appreciation for your patience with me on Tuesday. After 8 seasons and 8 episodes, it rarely happens that our technology fails us, but it did last Tuesday. And what would have been a 1-2 punch this week is, in fact, going to be reduced to a pretty massive 2-punch with Professor Holton tonight. We have rescheduled that session for November the 1st. And if you are interested in joining Ann Blaschke and myself to talk about Title IX at 50, you'll need to go back in and re-register. When you go to that page, you'll have to scroll all the way to the bottom. Please do so. As I look around the room, I also want to thank many of our new and savvy veteran faces that I see. Hey, Mark, I see that you're here with us from New Hampshire, I think for the first time. Thank you for joining us. James and Madeline are here from Walton High School. And Amer, I'm so glad you're able to get into the room. Amer's down in Atlanta. Jessica's joining us tonight from Niagara Falls, and Kara is joining us from Pennsylvania. Thanks to you both. Got a whole slew of past and present Teacher Advisory Council members. It's always great to see Lee Holder joining me from Kinston, North Carolina. Also, Kyle is in Superior, Wisconsin. Mariel is in Illinois. And Carl, it's great to see you joining us here from Mississippi. Speaking of Carl in Mississippi, I do hope that all of our audience and all of our colleagues and friends in the Panhandle, the Gulf Coast, and on the Eastern Seaboard is safe tonight. Growing up on the coast myself, I can tell you that hurricanes are no joke. And I'm very hopeful that our friends in the Tampa, St. Pete area, in Fort Myers, and throughout Central Florida remain safe and healthy tonight. Sherry, you're joining us from Spartanburg, South Carolina. Thank you for joining us. And as always, we've got a nice contingent of folks from Los Angeles Unified, Graciela, Robin at Burbank Middle School, Jacob at the Public Service Community School, Douglas, and Marie. Thank you all for joining. I do hope that you share information about our webinar series with your colleagues, and we continue to bring new faces to our program. I frequently think of the center as a laboratory. That may not make a lot of sense given that it's full of humanists, fellows who arrive each year with a project idea that explores the disciplinary boundaries of the humanities. But I often sort of find myself imagining what these fellows do behind their doors or in the library or in the commons. And it often reminds me of what I see anybody who's experimenting do, anybody in a laboratory sort of incubator space do, and that is to pull together all the tools and all the puzzle pieces of the field and try to assemble it in a really innovative way. Of course, in the humanities, we don't have lab tools like Bunsen burners and beakers and calipers and white lab coats. What we do have, however, are all of the detritus of the past and of memory and of the human experience, things like art and verse and material culture and primary source, things like diaries, things like maps, things like photographs. And it's always pretty special to be able to watch our fellows reconstruct these in an evidentiary way to tell a compelling narrative about our human past. I'm looking forward to tonight with Professor Holton for exploring how these primary sources of the American Revolution can also reveal a history that perhaps has been hidden. I'm also pleased that tonight's session is co-sponsored by the National Council for the Social Studies. I was privileged to be on the National Board of Directors for NCSS for 3 years, and I can tell you that NCS cares a lot about supporting teachers and supporting teachers in the good work that they do with their curriculum. The National Council for the Social Studies also is very invested in the use of primary sources in the teaching of history and social studies, and I do hope that you take time to explore their website, explore the various opportunities that they have for professional growth and the different publications they have that support a scaffolded, differentiated, appropriate approach to using primary sources with students of all ages. As you explore that website, you likely will also see their upcoming conference. Boy, it sure is nice to be able to say that we at least have the choice to reemerge and come back together in a conference setting. This year's NCSS conference will be hosted in Philadelphia on December 2nd and 4th. I'll be there. The National Humanities Center will be represented, and I do hope that any of you in the audience who joins us in Philadelphia will take time to say hi and give us a chance to meet in person finally. Of course, all the work that we do at the center, as well as work contributed by NCSS, is available for free and open platform called the Humanities in Class Digital Library. This is where we add all of the readings and the viewings that our scholars and our webinar guests have curated for you and asked you to spend time with before the session. But I also realize and recognize that oftentimes with a busy school week, with the pace of the academic calendar and the pace of teaching, that you may not have time to sit down and really go through these in a thoughtful way. If you haven't, I would encourage you to go back after tonight's session and pull out those sources, pull out those different documents and readings, and use them to support the conversation that we'll have tonight with Professor Holton. I also hope that you take a look into the future of our webinar series schedule, in particular if you're interested in topics in the 18th and 19th centuries. For example, in just a few weeks, Vincent Brown, past fellow at the center, will be joining me to discuss his work on Tacky's Revolt and the story of the Atlantic Slave War. Later in the fall, we'll have a session with two speakers, Christina Stansu from Virginia Commonwealth University and Brenda Child from the University of Minnesota. They'll be discussing their work on Indian boarding schools in the 19th and 20th centuries. Later this fall, past fellow Alan Taylor from the University of Virginia will join us to discuss his work titled American Republics, 1783 to 1850. And then finally, next March, after the new year, we'll be joined by independent scholar Jordan Taylor, who will work with us on understanding the role of fake news and media literacy during the American Revolution. Of course, all of our upcoming webinars, all 34 of them, are free, and I do hope that you share this information with your colleagues. Speaking of, I've often shared with you the online course catalog that we have available for teachers as well, and we've decided this fall to make one of these courses, Women of the Americas, Early Encounters and Entangled Histories, free to anybody who signs up. This course has a first-come, first-served limit of 40 participants because it does have a live instructor, and it is treated as a course. You can expect about 3 to 5 hours of work per week, and you will earn 35 professional development credit hours at the conclusion of the course. We developed this course in partnership with the New York Historical Society. It's got wonderful resources on teaching the role of women in the early period of American history, and I do hope that any of you who are looking forward to learning more about the topic, but also are looking forward to grabbing a bunch of CEUs in one fell swoop will consider taking this. Please use the discount code WAMS100 in order to take that course at no charge. Hey, there he is. Carl, thank you so much for being here, and I want to thank all of our Teacher Advisory Council members for joining us in Durham last week. We had a wonderful retreat. We were able to meet each other in person and talk about ways that we can learn from them about what's happening in the contemporary classroom. It's our goal to always make our work relevant, and the input and the contributions of our TAC as an annual group is always an important part of that. Also important are the contributions that each of you will make to tonight's discussion. Even though this is a discussion largely driven by the PowerPoint that Professor Holton has put together and conversation that he and I will have, we do want to bring your voice to the talk, and you do that using the audience chat box. Take a moment and greet your neighbors, but also use that as a place to share ideas and thoughts, respond to some of the things that are being discussed. If you'd like to submit a formal question, you can do so in the Ask the Professor tab. That'll come to me as the moderator, and when the time is right, we'll take a pause, take a breath, and I'll bring those questions forward, and we'll spend some time making sure we address topics of interest and clarification for you. So once again, you have joined us for the webinar titled Liberty is Sweet, the Hidden History of the American Revolution. In addition to Professor Holton, I'm joined tonight by Rachel Lance. Rachel is a teacher at Porta High School in Petersburg, Illinois, and she is tonight's teaching assistant. What that means is she's going to be in the audience chat box, asking questions, trying to ignore Joel from the other side of the table, sort of generally keeping things going, and then she's going to be developing some instruction based on what we learned tonight. Hey, Professor Holton, can you hear me down there in Columbia, South Carolina?
I sure can, Andy. I hope you'll call me Woody.
I will, Woody, thank you, and I appreciate you being here. In a moment, I'm going to hand you the reins to the slides and invite you to tell us this fascinating story, but if it's okay with you, I'd like to start with just a personal question. You have the advantage as a professional historian, as a as someone who digs deeply into the primary sources of the past of really being that sort of member of the humanities laboratory that I described earlier. In your experience in archives and working in the past and working with primary sources, can you think of one item, one document, one image, one primary source that when you held in your hand, it just gave you an electric shock? Like you're like, oh my goodness, Shazam moment. Can you think of something that really struck you that way?
I can think of plenty, including a map that I'm going to show you guys in just a few minutes, but I'll mention one in particular. I was at the beautiful Henry Huntington Library in San Marino, California, and was reading the papers of a British officer who was actually killed at Bunker Hill. He was mortally wounded there and died later. So it was a thrill, an eerie thrill, to read the letters of somebody who I knew was dying as he was writing this letter. I knew because he said it, and then the next letter is from someone else saying sadly he died. But none of that's what really gave me that electric shock you talked about, Andy, because what did give me the electric shock is I was writing this book, Liberty is Sweet. I wanted to say a bunch of new things about the revolution if I could, and he helped me because he claimed that on the return from Concord on April 19, 1775, everybody remembers that's the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The British were headed out to Concord to get gunpowder and other stuff that the colonists had stockpiled or cached out there. On the way back, a couple hundred of those soldiers were made casualties. And what this guy said in his letter was, all these guys are firing at us from every direction. One of the people firing at us was a woman. And that's the first report that anybody has of women actually taking up arms at Lexington and Concord. We all know later stories like Molly Pitcher, which is based on many true stories of women who helped make cartridges and hand them to their husbands, sort of thing. But here was a woman at Lexington and Concord, so that was a lot of fun.
That really does strike me as something that would just reach out and grab you. And as we discuss primary sources tonight, I'd like to remind our audience that students can have that same kind of feeling when they're, it's almost like time travel, when you can sort of channel yourself through these items. And I'm really pleased that your presentation tonight will showcase quite a few of them. Woody, I'm going to turn the slides over to you now. Thank you again for being here. As the moderator, I'll bring questions on occasion. We're looking forward to the story.
All right. Thanks, Andy. And thank you, everybody else, for joining. And I'm really psyched to try this format that National Humanities Centers has, where I think I get to talk for about 12 minutes, and then Andy's going to jump in and say, let's talk about those documents. What a great way that is to break up what could be, let's be honest, a dreadful 75 minutes of me droning on. So jump into the audience chat with your questions and disagreements. I think history is not a bunch of dates. It's a bunch of debates. So let's debate some of these issues. And I have tried to chop up my talk to fit into that format, but I also asked Andy, or warned him, sometimes I work up a head of steam, so feel free to jump in and interrupt me. So we're old friends, and so don't think that we're fighting each other. If you got to tell him in the chat, hey, shut him up because I got a question, I'm happy to take those as well. As I said, anything you want to disagree with would be fun to have that discussion. And so the pieces of this are, I want to talk about three groups that are generally depicted as either victims or beneficiaries of the American Revolution. But of course, a victim and a beneficiary has something in common, and that is they are the passive recipients that are acted on. But the three groups that I'm going to talk about, I want to argue, actually were active participants in the revolution that really influenced it. And those three groups are, in this order, Native Americans, women, and African Americans. And I'm going to argue in the first half or so that all of those three groups played critical roles in the political phase of the revolution, that decade from around 1763 to 1764. And then in the second half, that they played a critical role in the military phase from 1775 till the peace treaty in 1783. And while I'm talking about the political phase, I'm going to argue that all three of these groups, Native Americans, women, and African Americans, helped turn the revolution from its political phase, that is, where it's mere protest, into a movement for independence. So I want to focus on indigenous people and women and enslaved people, but I'm also going to wrap up at the end by talking about a very famous participant in the revolution, because I certainly don't mean by stressing the roles of these unheralded groups to say that the heralded people at the top, I certainly don't mean to say they were unimportant either. And I'm going to make the case that one of the most important of the patriots really exerted his influence by changing his mind on three key issues. But that'll be the icing on the cake that we get to in the end. Let's get started talking about the political phase of the revolution, 1763 to 1774, and talk first about the influence of Native Americans like Joseph Brandt or Tyandanegia, who was a Mohawk warrior and diplomat, shown here. And let me just start with, I think you'll agree with me when we're discussing in a few minutes, that this is a very favorable painting of him. And that was in itself is kind of arresting, because we think of this as a very racist era. It was white people thinking of Native Americans as savages, but also looking down on African Americans. But you're going to see some very favorable images of African Americans too. And by favorable, I just mean normal, depicting them as the real people that they were. But let's get into the substance of this. And there we are. Here's the map I wanted to show you. This is kind of a discovery too, Andy, because this was a map made, there's several of them made in 1765. And by British officers, what the red boxes indicate are regiments, and the bigger ones are regiments, the smaller ones are companies. And this map seems like a great place to start, because the first versions of this were done around 1763, and they depict the status quo at the end of the previous war against France, which people call the 7 Years' War, that it went for 9 years' war, or the French and Indian War, though there were a lot more participants than that. But here's the key decision that the British government made at the end of that previous war in 1763, and that was, we've doubled our British debt, almost doubled the British debt in that previous war. We need to stay out of war. Not because the British Prime Minister Lord Bute had suddenly become a peacenik, but because war is the most expensive thing governments do. We got to stay out of future wars. One of the groups they fought was Native Americans. And so the ministry, led by Bute, and then officially it got done in his successor Grenville's term, on October 7th, 1763, the British government drew that line that most of you are probably familiar with. The Proclamation of 1763 said to colonists, you can't go west of the line, and to Indians, you can't go east of the line. And it was meant to keep those two groups from going to war with each other, because the British would have to pay to put down, say, an Indian revolt like the one that Pontiac and Ottawa near Detroit actually carried out in 1763, and that became the final argument for the Proclamation Line. So the British drew this line in order to prevent a war against Native Americans, but it actually helped over the course of the next 12 years to cause a war against their own colonists, because, as George Washington put it, the greatest estates we have in this colony, he meant Virginia, the largest British North American colony, the greatest estates we have in this colony were made by taking up the rich back lands, which were thought nothing of in those days, but now are among the most valuable we possess. And so when you draw that blue line, you really piss off people like Washington, and Jefferson was also a big land speculator, Patrick Henry, James Madison, Ben Franklin up in Pennsylvania, and so on. Now, the line is not that effective against actual settlers, but is against speculators, because they can't sell land west of the line without title, and they couldn't get title because of the line. So I think a lot of people agree the Proclamation Line was an important grievance. It shows up in attenuated form in the Declaration of Independence. But I also want to talk about another grievance in the Declaration of Independence, and that's the Stamp Act, because you might be surprised to hear me say that Native Americans played a big role in that as well. Because, and this is where those red boxes come in, to enforce the Proclamation Line of 1763, the British government, Parliament, made an extraordinary decision in 1760. Fought many wars in America before, but this time, for the first time, they are going to leave 10,000 troops in America after the war to guard that line. So you see some are up there in Detroit. Actually, the map has Detroit on the wrong side of the straits, but Niagara, as in Niagara Falls and Pittsburgh and so forth. And they are there basically as peacekeeping troops to keep the Native Americans from attacking the colonists, but also to keep the colonists from attacking the Native Americans and provoking them or stealing their land, which would also provoke them. And so I think you can think of those 10,000 troops that Britain left in America in 1763 as peacekeeping troops. And the British government said, okay, we're doing this for the benefit of the colonists, although part of their own motive was to save themselves the cost of a war, but we're doing this for the colonists. It's reasonable that the Indians should pay for these 10,000 troops. And that was the context in which Parliament adopted the Stamp Act. And so when we teach students that wonderful phrase, no taxation without representation, the first big law that we're talking about there is the Stamp Act. And I'll tell you guys, I finally did something when I was researching Liberty is Sweet that I'd never done before, hate to admit, which was actually read through the Stamp Act. It's pretty long, but it's pretty clear in there that what the textbooks say about the Stamp Act is wrong. What they say is Parliament wanted the colonists to help pay off the giant debt it had run up winning the French and Indian War against the French and Indians. But if you actually read the act, no, this is not to help pay off the debt. It's to pay for those 10,000 troops. And so if I add up everything I've said so far, the point of those 10,000 troops was to keep Native Americans and colonists apart. And the purpose of the Stamp Act was to pay for the 10,000 troops. So I think it's fair to say, had there been no Native Americans, there would have been no Stamp Act. So here we have this big traditional red letter date. I put it in red letters on the origins of the American Revolution, and it wouldn't have happened had it not been for Native Americans pushing back, defending their land. Well, speaking of pushing back, and we'll get to one of those pauses in just a second, but I want to show you two more slides real quick first. That's the Capitol. Many of you have been to the Capitol that they have redesigned. They rebuilt in Colonial Williamsburg, but this is what it actually looked like in 1769 when Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and Patrick Henry were all sitting as burgesses, and they and the rest of the House of Burgesses of Virginia in 1769 unanimously sent a memorial to the British government saying, you got to get rid of that blue line, or it's blue on my map. You got to get rid of the Proclamation Line because we've used up all the land east of the mountains. We need to go west of the mountains. You got to let us have that land. And you can see they did that. The House of Burgesses did in 1769. But 1769 was also the year of something extraordinary. Do you see the blue star on my map kind of below 1769? It's on the border between, it's on the Wabash River, which is now the border between Illinois and Indiana. And at that blue dot, there was a group of Native American women. These were the female peace chiefs of the Wabash River nations, they're called the Miami Confederacy, and they sent wampum belts similar to this one to the Native nations east of them, saying, hey, despite that imaginary line the British drew up, and despite those troops being out there, colonists are still encroaching on our land. We need to reassemble the Pontiac Coalition and combat the colonists. We're going to launch a massive war because it's going to be a coalition of the Miamis and the Shawnees and the Delawares, and they later added nations south of the Ohio River like Cherokees and Muskogees and Choctaws. We're going to have this massive coalition to resist the colonists. And that's significant in itself, but it's also important for what it did to British officials, because they found out that these Native women and then later men were building this massive pan-Indian coalition, that is multinational Indian coalition to resist the colonists. And the British government did not. That's exactly what they didn't want, was a war against a lot of different Indian nations. And so the British government said no to those Virginians like Jefferson, Washington, and Henry, who wanted that land, and kept up that blue line, the Proclamation Line. In fact, it was never repealed by the British. The only thing that got rid of it for what's now the United States was the American Revolution, which revoked it. They still quote it in law cases in Canada. So Native Americans helped bring about the Proclamation Line, which really infuriated white colonists. They helped defend the Proclamation Line in 1769, and they also helped bring about the Stamp Act. So I think they need to be part of our lessons that we teach students about the origins of the American Revolution. And I'll stop there and see, Andy, have you collected any questions or thoughts?
Sure have. Thank you so much, Woody. And again, I'm going to remind the audience to drop formal questions in the Ask the Professor tab, and I'll be happy to bring them forward. This first question comes from Jacob. Jacob is in Albany, New York, and he's wondering if you can talk some about, please talk about the ways that these boundaries were communicated, not just from colonists to natives or Indians, but between each other, but to rural people. How did people know where these boundaries were?
Well, that's a great point. Let me answer something similar to that, and then try to answer that hard question. But the similar question I want to ask was, did Native Americans have boundaries before colonists showed up, or do they have internal boundaries among themselves? And they absolutely did. And this is so important because, like this map, if you look at it, drawn up by a British guy, it doesn't even show that there were any Native Americans. There were people, though, at the time who did at least put them on the map, but they'd have Shawnees out there above the Ohio River and Cherokees a little bit below the Ohio, closer to where I am in South Carolina. But they're just sort of vague. They just have the words out there. But the reality is that these native nations, just like European nations and most African nations, had very set boundaries among themselves. So they had a lot of experience with boundaries. And so when the British decided to do the Proclamation Line of 1763, and I slightly shortened that story. There was an earlier policy in 1761 that kind of did the same thing. When they did that, they rushed to convey those boundaries to Native Americans and say, hey, look, we know one of the reasons you were so mad at us was and joined the French in this war against us, as most of the Native nations did. We know that was a grievance for you against us. We have now redressed your grievance. We're going to stop our colonists at the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, which is the blue line I've indicated there. So my point is that boundaries were a diplomatic matter, as they are now, but the Proclamation Line in particular was a concession to Native Americans that the British were very careful to communicate to them. And they talked all the time. I put the wampum belt back up to talk about the fact that this was one of the tools of diplomacy. Instead of handing papers to a native leader who would not be literate, most people the British were dealing with in the 18th century, you hand them a wampum belt made out of beads, and it's got a symbol like this one. This is this tree of peace in the middle with the Mohawk and the Iroquois nations around it, appropriately for you up in Albany there, because you're, as you know, in Mohawk country. So anyway, my point is that the British had native agents, had Indian agents, as they called them, who were dealing with the natives and would communicate boundaries and also negotiate boundaries with them. It was an ongoing conversation.
Thank you for explaining that. I'm going to take a comment that Sundina made and turn that into a question. Sundina is joining us from Los Angeles tonight. Was it common for Native Americans to have maps, or was it more of an oral tradition where they knew those boundaries, but they weren't actually formalized or codified in a map?
That's a wonderful question, and the answer is they absolutely did do their own maps. They didn't have paper before the colonists showed up, but they indicated maps in various ways as part of their art and so forth. And their maps looked really different. They were often maps more about relationships among groups than boundaries, but they also had boundaries as a separate matter. But they tended to think that those relationships were more important than the territorial boundaries. So even though they had boundaries, they prioritized the relationships in their map making. But yeah, there's let me recommend a book to you called Powhatan's Mantle that has a wonderful article in it about Native maps, and it reproduces a bunch of them.
Fantastic, thank you. This question comes from Ida. Ida's in Los Angeles as well, and wonders if you could clarify, were Native Americans required to pay the stamp tax as well?
No.
Thank you. This next question comes from James. James is wondering, were there any warnings or precursors where colonists knew the Proclamation of 1763 was going to be adopted, or is this part of a statuary neglect?
Oh, that's a great question. And by the way, I tried to answer the last question briefly, but then I remembered that now natives, there are lots of natives in 1769, indicated the year on this map. There are lots of natives living east of this line, behind the frontier, to quote the title of a wonderful book about them. So, for instance, in my state of South Carolina, you can't quite see the Catawbas here, but there were the Catawba tribe who were allies of the U.S. I think there are still natives now on Martha's Vineyard, which has been in the news lately, who have always been there. And so, yes, if they want to do a legal document, for instance, they do need to get the stamp. So when I say the Stamp Act did not apply to Native Americans, it didn't apply to the Native Americans who were out in their own nations, but there were thousands of Native Americans still east of the frontier who did. So now on to the new question, which I have completely space. Remind me, Andy.
Yep. Let me ask again. This comes from James in Southern California. Were there any warnings or precursors?
Oh, warnings. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Because there was a ongoing battle back and forth between the people and the British government. There had been periods when the British government was just as expansive as George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, because they were up against the French, and they wanted to get to places like the one we now call Pittsburgh before the French got there. As you know, the French beat them to it, but there was this competition. So the British government, while the French were still there, the British government was kind of ambivalent. On the one hand, they wanted to get to places before the French could. On the other hand, they didn't want to make the Indians too mad. But they really discovered those conflicted with each other during the so-called French and Indian War. And so the date I would really take this question or two is 1758, when the British Indian agents met the representatives of several native nations at Easton, Pennsylvania, which is in eastern Pennsylvania on Delaware River, and signed a treaty saying, hey, look, if you will stop supporting the French in this war we're fighting against France, then we will agree not to expand west of the Appalachian Mountains. And that did, in fact, get a bunch of native nations to abandon the French and cause the French to have to abandon Pittsburgh, which they had called Fort Duquesne. They blew up their fort later in 1758 precisely because of that. So yes, it was not the Proclamation Line of 1763. I gave you the short version, but I'm glad you've asked, because it was the culmination of a longer effort on the part of the British to crack down on its colonists going west of the line. And the reason I focus on 63 is that as of 1763, the British are no longer ambivalent. They have nothing. They have no reason to support Western expansion. All they want is to hold their colonists close to the coast. A, for the reason I stressed, to avoid wars with the Indians, and B, for other reasons. It's easier to tax them when they're closer to the coast, and they're more likely to buy British manufactured goods like ironware and clothing if they're close to the coast. So once the French are out of the picture, the British are really that's the end of salutary neglect, because we don't have to appease our colonists because we're not worried about the French anymore.
Right. One more question, and then we'll move on. This one comes from Amer. Amer's in Atlanta, Georgia. We can look this up if you don't know the numbers. His question is, what were the relative populations of Native Americans and colonists west of the Mississippi River in the 1760s, 70s time period?
So west of the Mississippi, of course, there were still many more Native Americans than colonists. The big thing I think I'll say in answer to Omar is buy my book. It's only $4 on Kindle. Actually, right now they've got a sale if those of you who have Kindles, because I have in there a map of to answer somebody's previous question that shows the native boundaries. Unfortunately, only east of the Mississippi, because that's what the book is about. It's the Revolution, but it's got all the native as well as colonial boundaries, just to make the point that they had boundaries. And it also has a bunch of the native towns, because I'm mad at Ben Franklin. I love Ben Franklin most days, but he said, oh, the only people out there are scatterloping Indians, that is, wandering around as though they had no towns. And of course, they did have towns. Most maps don't show the native towns, so I do in my map. And I also have on page 20 of the book the populations, Native, African, and European, of all 26 of the British colonies that rebelled, as well as the French and Spanish colonies down the Caribbean, like the future Haiti and Cuba and so forth, and the populations of all the native nations east of the Mississippi River. So a lot of that population data that Omar wants are on page 20 of the book.
Page 20, thank you. Well, let's move forward, Woody, and then we'll take a break shortly and ask you some more questions.
Okay, and yeah, like I said, if I go too long, just jump in. All right, but so we've talked about Native Americans' influence, and I'm going to transition to my next topic by reminding you that on the night of December 16th, 1773, the Bostonians, who dumped 342 chests of East India tea into their harbor, dressed as Indians to do so, but they didn't do so. A lot of the textbooks get this wrong and say, oh, they framed Indians for what they did. And a lot of people get mad. Oh, here's yet another bad thing the colonists did to Native Americans, was to try to frame them for this crime. But no, they knew that no one was going to think actual Native Americans had done this. And then other people say, oh, they must have dressed that way to disguise themselves. As anybody committing a crime would want to wear a mask. And so instead of a mask, they carried tomahawks and put feathers in their hair or whatever. But that's not the reason. The reason they dressed as Indians, to use their term, was that for them, Indians were exemplars. That is, icons representing two things that they wanted to highlight. And the first of those things was freedom. Remember that John Locke, talking about the state of nature, he said, in the beginning, all the world was America. That is, people like him who believed that in this mythical state of nature, believed that Indians were in that state of nature, and in the state of nature, everybody is completely free. So Native Americans, for white colonists, even as white colonists on the frontier are killing Native Americans, for other colonists, and really for everybody, Native Americans are an icon or an exemplar of freedom. They're also icons and exemplars of bravery, and we have lots of true stories of bravery of Native Americans. But obviously, you need a certain amount of bravery if you're going to go take somebody else's private property and dump it in the harbor, and you're threatening them and all that. And so I think that's why they dressed as Native Americans, was they were going for that juju of bravery and the juju of freedom. But I'm using this as a transition to talk about my next group of people, because throwing tea in the harbor was not the only way to oppose the British tax on tea that had been adopted in 1767. Another was to boycott tea. And here is a newspaper, the Pennsylvania Chronicle, with a poem supporting the boycott not only of tea but of other British merchandise. And what's exciting about this poem is that it's written by a woman, and it's about women. And the context of this poem, you see it stated 1768, didn't run in the paper till the next year. The context of it is that Philadelphia merchants did not want to boycott British merchandise. Bostonians had started this boycott. Hey, we're mad at the British government for taxing tea and all this other stuff. And so let's really get their attention. Let's boycott their merchandise. Something like a third of British exports went to their own colonies. And so, man, we will definitely get their attention if we stop buying stuff from them. The same way that you and I, everybody on this call, we're boycotting Russia right now. They thought, well, this will be a way to pressure Britain, was to not buy their stuff. So Boston got that going. New York went along with it, but New York also said, we're only going to do this if the Philadelphia merchants also go along with it, because we don't want to lose all our trade to the Philadelphians breaking the boycott. And sure enough, the Philadelphians did break the boycott, refused to sign on to it. And so here's what Hannah Griffiths, an unmarried Quaker in Philadelphia, did. She wrote a poem, and I'll just quote the essence of it here, that's in blue. If the son so degenerate the blessings despise, let the daughters of liberty nobly arise. And so she's sort of organizing the women of Philadelphia to pressure the men of Philadelphia to join the boycott. And I don't want to give her all of the credit, but it is a fact that the men of Philadelphia did eventually sign on to that boycott, and it was quite effective, and it did persuade the British to abolish all of their taxes except of the one on molasses and the one on tea. And of course, the one on tea was the one that provoked the Boston Tea Party. But it's kind of cool to think this Quaker woman played a role in that. On the other hand, I'll also mention that while women were very supportive of the tea boycott, they made an exception. So here at the top is from the Boston Gazette, as you see, men saying, hey, we're the heads of the household. We can speak for our household. This is not me talking. This is the 18th century talking. And we're not going to import tea on any pretense whatever. That's on January 29th. So just 14 days later, and actually they did it sooner. It was a week later, but it was ran in the newspaper on the 12th. Women adopted their own boycott of tea. And a lot of people have quoted this, and it is pretty cool. But this is the value, Andy, of putting men and women in the same timeline. Because one little discovery I made was that the women's boycott, which comes a week after the men's boycott, says sickness accepted. And that's because we still have the expression today, Dr. Mom. Women were in charge of the medicine in most families, and tea was considered one of those medicines. And so they thought it was quite reasonable. Yes, we're going to boycott tea as a social thing, and something you just do for pleasure. But hey, sometimes we need to feed our kids tea as part of curing them. And so it's subtle, but the women are clearly standing up to the men. Well, I want to say one other thing about these boycotts, because if you're going to stop buying tea, that's fine. No one really depends on tea except for medicine, as I've just mentioned. But if you're going to stop buying clothing from Britain, which they did to varying degrees, they boycotted British merchandise 3 times, but in the third time in 1734, they really did stop buying cloth from Britain. And cloth was the number one thing they bought from Britain. And it gets cold here, and you can't go naked. And so what do you do to replace the cloth that you used to buy from Britain? You start making more of your own. And this is my chance to tell you that spinning was kind of falling out of fashion, at least on the coast in America by, say, 1767 or 8, because it was cheaper to buy cloth. The Industrial Revolution was already going in Britain, water power, that is, of course, and they could make cloth, and wages were pretty low over there too, so they could make cloth really cheap. and water transportation. So even though it's 3,000 miles, that's cheap also. And so people found it cheaper to make, if you live in Philadelphia, say, it's cheaper to buy cloth than to make your own. People had spinning wheels for idle hours. Maybe there's a spinster. Literally, that's where the term comes from. Your unmarried sister lives with you and helps pay for her food by spinning. But it had kind of become a day class A thing. That is, it's the thing that those rednecks on the frontier do, or spinsters do, or really poor women do. And so that's the problem when the boycott comes, that initially, at least, a lot of women resisted this imperative that they make the thread to replace the thread that imported from Britain. And that's when some women launched this initiative of what they called spinning bees or spinning matches, where a bunch of women would get together, usually at either a tavern, which was for much more than drinking in those days, or at the preacher's house, and 20 or 30 would bring their flax wheels. The flax wheels are the small ones that you can carry, and get together and spin. And they'd spin all day. They'd compete to see who made the most. They'd give it to the preacher because they're not producing that much there. But here's where the spinning bees are so important. They made spinning cool again. That people didn't feel like, oh, my neighbors will laugh at me and think I've gone poor if I start spinning. No, now it's a patriotic act. And so the important spinning was not the spinning they did at the bee, but the spinning they would do for the next subsequent months. But the spinning bee encouraged them to do that other spinning by making spinning cool again. And to kind of prove the point by the exception, you read about these spinning bees in Pennsylvania, New York, especially in New England, dozens of cases in little towns as well as big towns, but there were no spinning bees in the South, because in the South, the spinners were slaves, and spinning was so closely associated with slavery that you just couldn't get Southern white women to do it. And so that was the sort of limit to which people could go. Yes, you could get women spinning up north, but not in the South. Okay, so Andy, I've talked about women very briefly in the run-up to the revolution, but our time rushes, so I think we'd better stop there, see if there's any questions, and then I can move on.
Fantastic. We do have a couple of questions. The first one, and as you can imagine, you've said some things that directly puncture some of the more traditional and conventional stories that we tell in our classes and in our textbooks. And one that caught several people's eyes, and Allison from Santa Rosa Junior College in California submitted it as a formal question, and that's this. Did the colonists who participated in the Boston Tea Party provide written evidence that they dressed as Indians because they exemplified freedom and bravery? In other words, where did you come to these conclusions? What kinds of documents did you find that would suggest this?
That's a fair question from Santa Rosa. And I will say they didn't provide written evidence for any of their reasons. So, yes, it is still possible that the traditional reason that they actually thought they could fool the British into thinking these were Indians going woo, woo, woo as they chopped open with their hatchets the chest of tea to pour them out into the harbor. So, yeah, that's still a possibility. And the possibility that it was equivalent to what was called blacking has nothing to do with African Americans, but people would blacken their faces in England to go hunt on some gentleman's land. And so it's possible to infer from those traditions that, there is a long history of white people playing Indian that goes right up into the present. I'm embarrassed to say that I was 12 years old. I was in the Indian Guides, a bunch of white kids, a couple African-American kids pretending to be Indians. So that's, there is this whole playing Indian tradition. But I think even groups like the Indian Guides, maybe that's where I drew my inference that it was this other thing. But the real place I draw my inference, I don't have a signed statement, and so you're right to call me on that. I don't have the signed statement. Oh, we're doing this because they're exemplars, not a word they use very much. But where you can see it is in the cartoons, because what was always used to represent not always, almost always used to represent America in the cartoons, including two of the ones that you have as part of my primary sources packet here. America is always represented as an Indian, and often very favorably as this brave Indian warrior. And so that whole noble savage tradition of Native Americans as John Smith said, as the freest people in the world, and also as the bravest people. Lots of people adopted that noble savage myth. So yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, but the scholar from Santa Rosa,
Allison. Yeah.
Allison, she makes a good point. I don't have written evidence, but the other side doesn't have written evidence either. We're both going from context, and that's the context that I'm using.
A debate rather than dates. Thank you. One more question, Woody, and then we're going to move on in the interest of time. You mentioned earlier taverns, and so this question comes from Monica. Monica's in nearby Durham, and she wonders if you could talk some about this idea of the third space. That is to say, spaces where people spent time together, mingling, having conversations, making plans. It's not your workplace, it's not your home place, but a third place where you go and you're able to sort of share ideas. What was the role of the third space in colonial America?
It's a great issue to raise, Monica. I appreciate it. My short answer for Monica is go to Ireland. That is not to Dublin, but into the countryside, because you'll still find it there. I mean, I was astonished when I was over there one summer, sort of backpacking. People brought their kids to the bar, to the pub, because that's also where you get dinner. And I think there's some value, in having alcohol not be this adult space that kids are all psyched about. Anyway, won't do my modern social commentary, but it's absolutely the case that the ordinary, as they call it often in the South, or the taverns, were meeting places, and they were also hotels, and so the people were staying in there for them. But Monica, I'm kicking myself for taking out one of my images because I had too many, but it's from a wonderful book by Jay Fliegelman about the Declaration of Independence, where he reprints, and you can Google for this too, if you Google Declaration of Independence, diacritical marks. I'll write diacritical marks down in the audience chat, because there's these very cool copies of drafts of the Declaration of Independence with these marks that look like quotation marks, and what they really are was the printer had accidentally copied Jefferson and only meant for his own use, which was these little strokes that he had written to remind himself where to pause, because you pause for effect. And I mention that because the Declaration of Independence was meant to be read aloud. Of course, it's a written document that a lot of us make our students read, but a lot of people, more than half of men and many more than half of women, because of unequal educational opportunities, an understatement of the year, many more than half of women were not literate, and so that's how you were going to get it, was hearing it, and the place you were likely to hear it read was from a bar. Abigail Adams heard it read from the balcony of the State House in Boston, and Washington had it read in front of the regiments of the Continental Army, but a lot of people, that's where you'd hear it, is at a tavern. So yeah, third space is, or what does Habermas call it? The public sphere was really crucial. Thanks.
Great. Well, we have about 35 minutes left. Why don't we move it to your next section, and we'll take some more questions soon.
Okay, so let's talk about African Americans' role in the origins of the revolution. And man, if you thought what I said about the Boston Tea Party was controversial, brace yourself. First, another very natural, non-racist, in my opinion, image of an African American, this of a black soldier fighting, as you can see by what everybody else is wearing, fighting on the redcoats side in the Revolutionary War. Let me start with just some basic demographic facts. 1 in 5 Americans in the 13 colonies out of 26 that rebelled, 1 in 5 Americans were African American slaves. And once the war got going, something like 10,000 African Americans, almost entirely in the North, got free by fighting on the Patriot or American side. But another 10,000, as many of you know, got free by fighting on the British side, as this man did. And there was talk of that and worry about that on the part of whites very early. In fact, in September of 1774, Abigail Adams heard a rumor, may or may not have been true, but what she heard was that a group of Boston slaves, yes, there were slaves in all 13 colonies that rebelled. A group of Boston slaves went to Governor Gage, who was also commander-in-chief of British forces in North America, and said, we know you need people. You're outnumbered with your soldiers. There's not a lot of loyalists. And you know you need fighters. We slaves will fight on your side, the British side, if you will promise to give us our freedom. And she'd heard that Gage was taking it seriously. He didn't for a while, but it kept being discussed by whites. And there were meetings by African Americans in Virginia in November of 1774, in South Carolina, all through the spring of 1775, more in Virginia in April of 1775. And all of this initiative on the part of African Americans resulted in this extraordinary document that I hope everybody shares with their students. There it is. A proclamation that was really an Emancipation Proclamation issued by a guy who didn't believe in emancipation. His name, as you can just see, I've kind of cut it off there, Lord Dunmore, issued this. It says November 7th. He issued it on the 15th, the day after his black troops won a victory over the Princess Anne County militia in Virginia. That's now Virginia Beach. And the commander of the Princess Anne County militia was captured by one of his own slaves. Imagine that conversation. But on the heels of that victory, Dunmore issued this Emancipation Proclamation saying a lot of ifs. You got to be owned by a rebel like Washington or Jefferson. This offer does not extend to my own slaves. Governor Dunmore was very clear. And then if you're owned by a rebel, if you can make it to my lines, and if you survive the war, then I will give you your freedom. So it's got a lot of ifs, but of course so did Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. So I think they're more similar than different. I've been debating that on Twitter for a long time, so maybe some of you will want to debate that with me as well. But anyway, it was an Emancipation Proclamation, even though the guy was not anti-slavery in principle. But a couple things about it. The first is that it came at Black initiative, even though when it shows up in the Declaration of Independence, it's these 7 words: he has excited domestic insurrection amongst us. That is, Congress in the Declaration of Independence, as its capstone grievance against the British, said, and you know what we're maddest about? And you can really see it in Jefferson's rough draft, which I've also given you in the pack of the documents, because it's the longest grievance, the only one where he calls the king a bad Christian, the only one where he uses all caps. And what grievance am I talking about? It's this informal alliance that the British made with the slaves. Not all of the slaves, but the slaves who were able to join them. This alliance came at the initiative of Blacks, even though Parliament said, oh no, it's the British stirring up our slaves because our slaves love us, and only with an outside agitator are they doing this alliance. But the other thing I want to say about it is, as of September 1774, or even November 1775, the colonists were furious at the British, but they didn't, most of them, want independence. They just wanted their grievances to be redressed. And that late in the game, the British could have gotten the colonists back by redressing their grievances. But once, at least in the South, they were so mad about Lexington and Concord up north, maybe it was too late up there, who knows. But the point is, Dunmore's proclamation infuriated white Southerners. As one friend of Thomas Jefferson named Archibald Carey said, he talked about how furious everybody was at the British for aiming a dagger at our throats through the hands of our slaves. And even people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine, who were very much against slavery, they were furious. And Paine said anybody would say we're justified in declaring independence, he said this in Common Sense, by the fact that the British have made this alliance with our slaves. So I think that's a really important part of the story of the origins of the Revolution, where you've got white colonists who are already mad about things like the tea tax in 1774 and 5, but they need an extra push to go over the cliff into independence. And in the North, that's really the Battle of Lexington and Concord, where so many Americans were killed. there were very few wounded and prisoners, Americans at Lexington and Concord, because the British killed everybody they could find. Colonists were furious about that. But in the North, in the South, the sort of southern counterpart to Lexington and Concord was this alliance that I was about to say the British made with the slaves, and that's how the Congress and other whites described it, but it was really an alliance that the slaves made with the British. That is what provoked many, not all, but that's what convinced a lot of whites to go ahead and declare independence. And since we're running low on time, I'm going to also put in the chat a little thing I did on Twitter. But if you will just Google this this thing that I'm putting in the chat, hang on, don't worry about the number one, bit.ly /countdown to 1619. If you'll Google that, you'll get 76 documents in which white Americans expressed their anger at the British for allying with the slaves. So one more thing about this, and then we'll be time for more questions. It wasn't just women who did that. Edward Hand was a very significant general on the American side, and he is running an ad for a slave who ran away from him, named Sue in Pennsylvania. And those of you who can read that, I'll leave it up for a while, can make it out. He says that she ran away with a white lady, so there was lots of interracial cooperation, ran away with a white lady named Captain Molly. That is Molly, one of the sources for the Molly Pitcher story. And we actually have an image of one of the black women who escaped to the British and then after the war resettled with them in Nova Scotia, named Rose Fortune. So I'll leave that up as well while I take any questions that people have about the African American role in the origins of the Revolution.
Just one question right now, I think, Woody. This comes from Candace. Candace is in California and asks, you may have already addressed this, but I think maybe clarifying it. Was the issue of chattel slavery one of the catalysts behind the Revolutionary War?
I'm going to say yes, but Candace, I wouldn't put it that way, and I'll tell you why. My friend Nicole Hannah-Jones, the lead author or the creator, really, of the 1619 Project, she put it pretty similarly to the way you did. And that, if you put it that way, it kind of sounds like the British were anti-slavery and their colonists in America were pro-slavery, and the British were getting ready to free the colonist slaves, and the colonists didn't want them to free their slaves, and so they rebelled. And I would not put it that way. You've really got to look at the American Revolution in stages, where the British defeat the French, and now they want all these reforms. That's the end of salutary neglect, and it's really the British are playing offense the whole time. And so the British want to tax the colonists. They want to crack down on smuggling. They want to stop Western expansion, which they'd previously encouraged, as I said at the beginning. The British are trying to do all this stuff. The colonists resist all these British initiatives, and then the British punish the colonists for their resistance at Lexington and Concord by allying with the slaves, by closing their coasts and so forth and so on, by burning cities like Falmouth, Massachusetts, now Portland, Maine. And it's what pushed the colonists to independence was those punishments. But you saw, I won't go through it again, but the punishments were 5 links down the chain, and that's what pushes the colonists to rebel. And the bigger point, Candace, is the British were not anti-slavery. The British were pro-winning the war. So Dunmore's proclamation was a war measure, just like Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation would be a war measure, a practical measure to win the war, with the difference being that Lincoln, of course, was against slavery in his heart, and Dunmore and other British officers were absolutely not, because they had slaves of their own.
Thank you so much for addressing that. One more question, we'll move on. This one comes from Pranaya, who is in Marietta, Georgia. And the question is this: were the African Americans who fought for the British primarily men, or were there any African American women also directly involved in these military efforts?
Great question, because I said, I'm going to go back to the Emancipation Proclamation for a second. It says, I'm extending this offer to those able and willing to take up arms. And so he didn't say males, but he's clearly, it's the 18th century. able and willing to marry or to take up arms means men, and yet I was able to calculate because we have this amazing book, now a major motion picture, as well as a very great novel called The Book of Negroes. The Book of Negroes was a real thing in the 18th century. It was a list of 3,000 blacks who evacuated with the British. There's a lot of bad things to say about the British, but one good thing is they kept this promise. If you did survive the war and you fought on their side throughout, they evacuated you at the end. What I found on that list, I looked just at the Virginians because my first book was just about Virginia, and the plurality of the people who joined Dunmore were men, but the majority of the people who joined Dunmore were women and children. That is, if you add the women who grabbed up their kids and left and joined Dunmore, they were larger than the number of men. And that was true for the Book of Negroes in general. Mary Beth Norton, for her wonderful book called Liberty's Daughters, drawn from that poem I showed you a second ago. In Liberty's Daughters, she showed that for the whole 3,000 group of African Americans who evacuated New York City, which the British had controlled for most of the war, but finally evacuated in 1783, the blacks who evacuated with the British in 1783, majority of them were women and kids as well.
Fantastic. Woody, why don't we move forward? We've got about 25 minutes, and so I want to make sure we have time for your remaining sections.
Okay. We may not get to all of them, but they'll be on but I'll come back. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about those same three groups much more briefly, I promise, in the war itself. And because talking about Native Americans, for starters, the extraordinary thing I want to tell you is the extent to which Native Americans won the war in the West. So this may be another debate as well, but I will say most historians would say what I'm saying, that they really kicked the Native Americans, although there were terrible massacres of Native Americans in the Indian War that was part of the American Revolutionary War, but in terms of the colonists expanding onto their land, not a lot during the war. Thomas Jefferson set the goal Fort Detroit, and so did Washington. Jefferson at the time was governor of Virginia, Washington as commander-in-chief, and others. They actually developed about a dozen plans to capture Detroit. And why Detroit? Because that was the armory where the Native Americans attacking Pennsylvania and the Carolinas and Virginia and New York. That's where they got their guns and ammunition. And so, quite plausibly, the Patriots thought, if we can capture Fort Detroit and get the British out of that area, they can't hand guns and ammo to the Native Americans attacking us. So they came up with a dozen plans to attack Detroit. But guess what? Not one of those expeditions against Detroit got anywhere near the place because of those same Native Americans defending Detroit. So George Rogers Clark tried a couple of times, didn't make it, and many others. And so that's one sense in which they won the war in the West. And here's another one, an image from my book. I had this great map maker, Jeff Ward, and this is from, you probably can't see it that well, but you can in the $4, to plug it again, the $4 Kindle version or the hard copy version. Paperback will be out in a couple of weeks. Anyway, this is from 1780, a real low point of the war for the American side, as I'll discuss in a minute. But look at all these initiatives, starting in Detroit, starting at Fort Niagara, which also was an armory for the Indians. They attacked as far west as St. Louis, which was a Spanish town. But remember, the Spanish were informal allies of the Americans. So when you hit the Spanish, you're hitting the Americans. And on the other side of the Mississippi was the town of Cahokia, once this great, vast, ancient Indian city, now a much smaller town, but it's peopled by Native Americans who are on the Patriot side, the American side, as they call themselves. And so my point is just that now not all of these attacks succeeded, but the one into Pennsylvania did, the one into Kentucky did. They were really in the cockpit. They were in the driver's seat for much of the war. So we can stop there, but that was just a brief thing. So maybe I'll keep going and talk about another a group during the war. And here's where I'm going to play a little game with you, Andy. this is the cover of my book, but I'm going to zoom in on the American at the left holding the pistol on these two British troopers or cavalrymen. This is an incident that early histories tell us really happened. It's possible they made it up, but I think it's probably true. An incident where this happened near my home in South Carolina. The two British troopers are bringing a message from Augusta, Georgia, to a British general, but the American waylaid them with that pistol. Actually, there were two Americans, but this is a sort of zoomed-in version of the image. And captured that message and sent it to the American general, Nathaniel Greene, instead. But I put that image on the front for a particular reason, and that is that this American has a secret. And so look in the chat for me, Andy. I'm not good at looking at it. And see if anybody can go into the chat and tell us what this American secret is.
Okay. Woody, we're going to take just a moment and let folks flex their fingers and get to the audience chat to see who's going to tell us be the first to tell us the secret that this image.
While you're hunting for this American secret, I'll tell you, I didn't get it. I had asked for an image, and I said, no, this image doesn't portray the people I want to portray. But Joel, though, good for you, Joel. You win the prize. That is, and actually Fabiola. I'm going to stop looking at the chat, but Fabiola qualifies. Yeah, it's a woman dressed as a man, and there were actually two of them, two sisters, not sisters. They had married brothers, so we call them the Martin sisters, who heard about this message being transmitted and saw an opportunity to be useful, and so they waylaid these guys and sent this message. And of course, I'm just mentioning them as an example because there were so many women who participated in the war in various ways. We even have, and you're going to make my PowerPoint available to people, aren't you, Andy, or are you? I hope so, because we have a photograph. This is one of the women who participated in the Revolutionary War on the American side. And I think it might be fair to say she fought on the war because we know of at least one time when she stood sentry at King's Bridge, the only bridge off of Manhattan in those days at the very northern tip of the island. And George Washington actually came along and said, "What are you doing standing sentry? Who ordered you to, who said you could be here?" And she said, "Someone who had authority to make me be here, to order me be here, sir." So she kind of rebuked George Washington and said, "Hey, I'm here by permission." Her name is Sarah Osborne. And as far as we know, this is the only one of the women who worked for the Continental Army and lived long enough to be photographed. And it's kind of an extraordinary thing. And I put her up for a particular reason because we tend to call these women camp followers. Please don't. I got to change it right at the last minute before my book went to press because I have a student from Missouri named Riley Sutherland who studied this and found out no one called them camp followers at the time. That term actually comes from Bengal in 1781 is the first time we see it appear. And she makes the case, my grad student does, that it's a bad word to use, camp follower, because it kind of sounds like groupie, you know, the people who follow a band and are just gaga about the band, and they're sort of leeches. Whereas these women were not followers by any means. They were right there in the thick of things. For instance, saving lives, not only as nurses, but you know a great way that women saved the lives of Continental soldiers? Why, washing clothes. Because when you take one of those shirts from a Continental soldier and put it in boiling water to wash it, you're killing the lice, and lice are the biggest spreaders of typhus, which was the number 2 killer of soldiers after smallpox. So let's move on, and I'm going to skip a couple here because I really want to get to because I really want to get to talking more about women in the war, and specifically, I already mentioned that
Hey, Woody, we seem to have lost your audio. So I'm going to pause for just a second. What you might do, Woody, if you would, hit that mute button, you know where it is on the presenter bridge. See if you can toggle your audio back. I find myself saying for the second time this week to the audience, thank you for being patient. The gremlins are out. Woody, we still can't hear your voice. So Woody, I'm going to suggest, I can see that you're moving the PowerPoint. Hey, folks in the audience, can you hear his voice? Because I'd hate to think that it's just me. Okay, thanks, Carl and Leela. Thank you, everybody. Be patient with me. I'm going to ping Woody. By the way, I appreciate everybody saying no. Let's see. Let me see if I can find you. Hey, Woody. So I will say to everyone in the audience, the fact that Woody doesn't seem to hear me either tells me that something is lost on his side. He's moving through the slides. I can guarantee you he is telling a good narrative, fantastic and interesting story. Hey, Woody, can you hear me? Hey, Professor. Hey now, hello. Hey, Woody. Hello. Joel, I think he is. You know, it could be, there's definitely, thank you, Allison, for pointing that out. There is a ton of bad weather, of course, in the Southeast. All of you folks know this from the news. Hurricane Ian has torn up Florida and is moving up the eastern seaboard. So it could well be that that Professor Holton in Columbia, South Carolina. Columbia is in the mid part of the state, but you may recall from previous hurricanes like Gloria that South Carolina can be deeply affected as well. So yeah, boy, I tell you what, Sandina, you're absolutely right. I'm sort of filibustering, hoping that he's going to pop back on. Carrie, wouldn't this be an awesome way for him to sell books? He gets to the punchline, gets to the best part at the end, the icing on the cake, he called it, and instead he's suddenly muted. Folks, I'm going to give him just a couple of more minutes. I don't want to take up too much of your time if he does have audio problems, and clearly he cannot hear us. And so, hey, Woody, hello. Carl, wouldn't it be funny if it was yeah, thanks, Casey / Andrew. Hello, Woody. Professor. Folks, be patient with me. I can see that Woody is moving through the slides. He's talking as if we can hear him. What I'm going to do is mute myself, and I'm going to call his cell phone. So please don't give up on us. Stick around. We've got just a few more minutes in tonight's session anyway. I'm going to see if I can reach him on his cell phone. I'm going to mute myself, though. Hey, Woody. Hello, hello. Yeah, Jacob, thank you for asking that. Jacob is in at Patrick Henry Middle School and asked me if I could send him a private message, which I've done. But unfortunately, he's so busy telling his story that he's not looking at the chat box. Hello, Professor. So I can see from the slide deck that he's about to come to a break, and I suspect that he's going to pause, and he's going to try to find my voice, and maybe that will send him down to the presenter chat. Joe, you're right. I'm going to ask him to log out and come back in. Stick with me. We've got 8 minutes. I think we can fill it. I think we can return to his story. Professor Holton, can you hear me? Okay, let's see if he realizes now that he's on his own in this digital universe. Hey, Woody, can you hear me? Professor Holton, can you hear me? Hello, hello. Okay, folks, he did see my private message. He's going to log out and come right back in. So hang tight. Maybe this will kickstart his audio connection. You know, I have to be honest. Running these webinars regularly now for as long as we have, as I have 8 years, 40-some episodes a season. It always feels a little surreal that we've got this kind of networked webinar audience, and we're all here together. And I'm surprised that more things have not gone wrong technically and sideways. And by that, I simply mean things like power outages or the internet doesn't work. I can think of 1 or 2 times where that's happened. This past Tuesday, to answer your question, Ida, our guest, Professor Ann Blasky, inadvertently closed the webinar room. And when you close it, you can't reopen it. The room is essentially spent. It expires. The link dies. And so once she closed the room by mistake, then we couldn't use that same room again. So that's why many of you logged in and you heard just like a minute or so of she and I trying to figure out her audio. So tonight's a little bit different. I think the internet connection seems to have slipped on Woody's end. So in just a moment, we're going to see him come in, and we'll conclude tonight's talk. I can think of at least one time, maybe twice, where bad weather kept me in my classroom with my students until about 8 or 9 p.m. Couldn't get off the hill because of tornado watch or bad weather. So similarly, we're stuck together right now, just a couple of minutes. Hey, Woody, can you hear me? Hello, hello.
Hey, I'm back. Very sorry.
You are back. Woody, thank you so much. I want to tell you that there has been some conversation around this being a conspiracy, in that you got to the best part of your talk and then you disappeared, and now we have to buy your book.
That's it. That's a good conspiracy. I like that.
That's a pro move, I got to tell you, Professor. So I will also tell you that we lost your voice, and you clearly lost ours as well, on about slide 45. So I don't mind extending this an extra 5 minutes. for our audience, we certainly understand if you need to log off at 8:30, that's the time we assigned to this. But if we can stick around and maybe you can recap this for us and move to your last section, that'd be great.
Great. Yes. I'm gonna pop back just a little bit. I actually was skipping a bunch of those slides anyway. I do want to make sure everybody saw the photograph of the only one we know of the woman.
We definitely heard this. Yes.
Who worked for the Revolutionary Army. Okay, so I'm going to skip a bunch of slides there and go to 1780, the real low point of the Revolutionary War for the American or Patriot side. I told you about that. I showed you the map of all of the British and Native American attacks on the western frontier. But even worse for the Americans was losing Charleston on May 12, 1780 to the British. And even worse than losing Charleston, South Carolina, was losing 5,000 Continental soldiers who had been there to try to defend it. And so in terms of morale, the absolute low point of the Revolutionary War was May 12, 1780. And so this lady decided to try to do something about that. Esther Reed was an immigrant to America, having come over just 10 years earlier with her new husband, Joseph Reed. But by 1780, Joseph was the top guy. They called him the president. We'd say governor today of Pennsylvania. And so she was the first lady. And her idea was to have the ladies of Philadelphia go out knocking on doors, door to door, collecting money, and then use that money, big fund, to distribute cash to the soldiers so they can go out and spend on them whatever they want, or gifts to show them how much people appreciated what the soldiers were doing. And so she began that effort and got a bunch of women in Philadelphia involved, and then actually it ended up spreading to other colonies. She sent letters to all of the first ladies, for instance, Martha Jefferson down in Virginia, and they raised a ton of money. For instance, the Marquis de Lafayette gave, I can't remember, it was like 1,000 guineas, a huge amount, in honor of his wife back in France. So they raised all this money and were getting ready to hand it over to the soldiers. And then this guy stepped in, George Washington, and said, hold on, I don't want you to give my soldiers all that cash for two reasons. One, I'm supposed to be paying them cash every month, and we haven't been able to pay them. And so they're going to ask, wait a minute, how come these ladies can come up with money to pay us when you can't, General Washington? So it's going to cause more discontent among the troops. And he also had an even bigger reason for the women not to give this money to the soldiers, was his fear. These are young men. They're going to go out and spend it on liquor. So he proposed an alternative. Don't give them money. Use that money to buy cloth and sew it into shirts and give them shirts, because we haven't been able to supply them with shirts in a long time. And then Esther Reed did something that very few people did between 1732 and 1799, the years of George Washington's life. She said no to him. She said, I don't want to give the soldiers something they need. I want to give them something they want, and let them decide with the cash. But Washington wrote back saying, no, you really can't give them cash. And at that point, she did give in. But interestingly, on another point, Washington said, hey, until you can buy the cloth, I want you to keep the money in this bank. But she knew the bank he was talking about had been founded by her husband's political enemies. And she wrote Washington back saying, that I will not do. I'm not going to prop up this bank that's being run by these guys who hate my husband and are trying to get him defeated at the next election. So they basically kept the money under their mattresses, but they did go out, spend the money, bought the cloth, made 2,000 shirts for the soldiers. And the soldiers, those shirts did help restore morale, especially for the Pennsylvania line, that is the Pennsylvania soldiers fighting in the Continental Army, because they mutinied in January of 1781 over shirts plus a lot of other issues. And how did they appease these soldiers? A lot of ways. But one of the things they did to appease these soldiers was give them some of those shirts that Esther Reed and the other women had made. So I like to think of Esther Reed as the woman who loosened the purse strings of Lafayette and who stood up to George Washington. Esther Reed also got plagiarized by Thomas Jefferson. So let me say that to conclude. She knew that a lot of the women she was appealing to were not going to be into this idea of going out door to door raising money. Going door to door was something women did, maybe out selling eggs from their farm, for instance, but not ladies. And so she had to sell it to them. So she wrote this broadside on the right, Sentiments of an American Woman, to persuade other women to go along with this. And I strongly suggest you Googling Sentiments of an American Woman and printing it out to read and share with your students is an amazing document. Because one of the things she did to convince these women that this was a cool thing to do and not unladylike was point to all the powerful women in the Bible and women who had been monarchs. And you see right above where I've yelled out, she talks about Elizabeth, like Queen Elizabeth I of England, and Catherine the Great of Russia. But look what she said they did. They have extended the empire of liberty. Now, before her, empire of liberty had only been used as a euphemism for heaven. She's the first person to bring it literally down to earth. She's the first, but she's not the last. Because you might remember my saying before we got disconnected that Thomas Jefferson, as governor of Virginia, sent George Rogers Clark out to attack Detroit. And he did that with a letter of December 25th, 1780. And I forgot to say that Sentiments of an American Woman, Esther Reed wrote in June of 1780. She sent it to Martha Jefferson, who apparently showed it to her husband, Thomas, but Thomas also got a copy of his own. And he, in this letter to George Rogers Clark, sort of meant as a public document, and it became quite public. My friend Gordon Wood used it as the title of his book, Empire of Liberty. And it's one of the most famous Jefferson expressions after the Declaration of Independence of this notion of America as an empire of liberty. But it's pretty clear that he got it actually from Esther Reed. So I can stop there, and if there's any questions, I know we're over. I would go on for another half an hour, but I know you guys can't. So
yeah,
maybe
I'll tell you what we'll do. We're officially in stoppage time. I want to let our audience know that I certainly understand if you need to log off. It's at 8:30 when we generally conclude. But you did promise some icing on the cake, Professor, and so maybe rather than going through, I see that there's still quite a few slides. Maybe rather than that, maybe let's go to the icing. Let's get a taste of that, and then we'll conclude with that final remark.
Okay, but I'm going to redefine icing because this is one topic I really want to talk about.
Good.
And I'm going to skip to the easiest parts of this. Let's start here. The Declaration of Independence. I want to argue to you guys, and I do want to save time for argument if anybody wants to, but maybe we got to go. You just said that. But the Declaration of Independence, we think of as one of our great freedom documents, but I want to argue to you guys that it was not originally that, about equality. The notion of created equal was not what most people thought of when they thought about the Declaration of Independence. Here's what they thought about. Notice that in the last paragraph, Congress of the Declaration, Congress uses independent states in all caps 3 times. It was about independence, not about equality. As the founding editor of the Jefferson Papers said, there's nothing against monarchy in there. It's against George III, but not against monarchy. In fact, it was kind of a pro-monarchy document because the reason, of course, they had all these reasons for declaring independence. We've talked about a bunch tonight. But the reason they went ahead and did it then was to contract alliances. You can't do that unless you're independent. And who do they want to contract alliances with? This guy, Louis XVI, who was himself a king. So they weren't against kingship in principle. They just wanted to get rid of a bad British king so they could make an alliance with the good French king and get his navy. In fact, there were people in Congress, Jefferson said, who thought, man, if we can declare independence quick enough, we can have a French navy allied with us and in American waters, by the end of the summer of 1776 to help fight our battles for us. And here's the most controversial thing I'll say all night. In that, its main goal, break the British alliance in order to create a French alliance, the Declaration of Independence failed. It failed because the idea was to get them there quickly. And as everybody on this call knows, they didn't actually get the British there until 1778. And so if that had been the end of the story from the Declaration of Independence, we wouldn't really know it today. As Lincoln said, it would just be like wadding on the field. That's the paper that they put the gunpowder in a cannon, and it just ends up blowing along the battlefield after the battle. But that was not the end of the story. The Declaration of Independence was not just an ordinance of secession, primarily because of this man, a free black soldier in the Continental Army named Lemuel Haynes, who many of you know for other things, like he was the first black minister of a white church. But in 1776, he wrote a pamphlet against slavery. He himself was free, but he wanted blacks to be free, wrote this pamphlet, Liberty Further Extended, and he needed an epigraph, something to start the thing off. And how did he start it? Well, this other document had just been published, the Declaration of Independence, and he his pamphlet with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," making Lemuel Haynes the first person to ever quote that part, created equal, that part of the Declaration of Independence. And it turns out that 19 of the first 27 people to quote the Declaration of Independence, that's how many times, this phrase, created equal, was quoted between 1776, when Lemuel Haynes quoted it, and the end of the century in 1799. 27 people quoted created equal. 19 of them were people campaigning against slavery. People like Benjamin Banneker wrote a letter to Jefferson quoting created equal back to him and saying, "Hey, why can't you apply that to us?" And also white abolitionists like Quakers. My point is that by quoting created equal, black and white abolitionists kept the Declaration of Independence alive. They made it something that Congress, yes, had said created equal, but that wasn't the focus. The focus for them was the stuff in all caps about independent states. But anti-slavery people kept created equal alive. And then that got pushed further in the 19th century, because what did Elizabeth Cady Stanton begin? How did she start the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments in 1848? "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." So we really owe it to Lemuel Haynes and other anti-slavery people, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and pro-women's rights people like her. They're the ones who took what was really just a secession document, the Declaration of Independence, as originally written, and they turned it into what Eleanor Roosevelt is holding there. They turned it into a universal Declaration of Human Rights. And by the way, they did the same thing with the Liberty Bell. Until abolitionists made it their symbol of their campaign, the Liberty Bell was just a bell. Okay, I'll stop and take any questions that you have time for, Angie.
Woody, I think we're running late enough. I'm not sure I can bring tons of questions in right now, but I will bring one to you, and then I'm afraid I'm gonna have to conclude tonight's session. And that question comes from Amer. Amer has made a few comments tonight, and I think he has a question that I think would wrap up well, because you've offered a lot of controversial views, and that's this. Professor, how do we keep our personal biases and points of view from morphing our interpretation of primary sources? Professor, can you hear me? Folks, I think we have lost Woody yet again, a last time, and I apologize for that, but I do want to thank you for joining tonight's webinar. I do encourage you to look into Professor Holton's research and his work. He's done absolutely amazing works of history that will be important and very accessible, I think, for you and your students. I also want to thank you for joining us for this webinar. It was a couple of nicks and dings as we went through the night, but it was an enjoyable conversation, and I do hope that you follow future opportunities at the center, including on our social media, the upcoming webinars. Our next webinar will be on October the 7th. I'm joined by Lauren Turek from Trinity University. She'll be working with us on an episode titled Christian Nationalism and Internationalism, Evangelicals and U.S. Foreign Policy in Modern History. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day at school tomorrow. Be safe if you're on the Eastern Seaboard with the hurricane. We'll see you next time in the Humanities in Class webinar series.